let's talk about Estonia. What was it like doing this segment there? Why did we go there? What brought us there?
I think sort of, again, organically we're piecing this special together. We're hearing things in the field. We're starting to articulate with Julia Yaffe what we're hearing in the field and where that comes from. But frankly, what we started to understand was there's a misunderstanding on the ground as to what life next to Russia actually looks like. And hence, here comes Estonia, a place that John Bolton said, if you're going to go now. And that's because
Which is pretty dark.
It's a pretty dark thing to say, but that fear is palpable. Estonia is on the border with Russia. There is talk right now that if Putin goes unchecked, that he will continue to be the aggressor, and Estonia very well could be next. And so this was an opportunity for us to go talk to the Estonian Prime Minister, learn a little bit about the importance of NATO, and again, try to close the gap from our perceptions and our reality. Because when you're halfway across the globe in Pennsylvania, your assumptions as to what Russia is like is very different than when you're a handful of kilometers from a Russian border. You have a better understanding of actually what's happening on the ground.
You're back in America right now, though, Jordan. You don't have to use kilometers.
Miles.
You don't have to use it. I know you're still in that frame of mind. I'm wearing a Tallinn T-shirt, but we use miles here.
We do, right?
Rightfully, logically, use miles.
I still can never wrap my head around it.
It makes so much sense. It's not even worth spending any more time on. That's how much sense miles makes. All right, I want to talk about meeting the Prime Minister and your interview with her. Your impressions. She has been outspoken critic of Putin, has been front and center on the need to kind of, strengthen NATO. As we said in the special, she's on a Vladimir Putin most wanted list and kind of proud of that, which is kind of interesting. And
for a fascinating reason, too, right?
Right.
Like she was taking down essentially Russian, I believe it was a Russian tank.
But now functioning as a monument to that occupation. Right?
Exactly, yes, which I think is an interesting comparison to what is happening in the U.S. as well. A Russian tank was out there, and as the Ukrainian war amplified, she was like, why do we have these monuments to Russian aggression here? Let's take this thing down. Vladimir Putin doesn't like it, and now she's on the most wanted list.
How dare you take my tank away?
Let my tank stand.
Let this tank stand. There were some other reasons that this was an interesting story and the right place to go, and we didn't have time to touch on all of them in the special, but one thing about Estonia is that it, like Ukraine, has a Russian-speaking population near the border of Russia. And they fear that, like Ukraine, Putin will use that as an excuse to send in his military and use it as cover to say, I'm protecting these Russian-speaking citizens. They feel threatened. They need my protection, so I'm sending troops in. And that could very easily be the same logic. One thing we learned just before we went there, which is almost maybe even hours before we got on a plane to go to Estonia, was that apparently Russian security forces had been jamming the GPS systems of planes coming to land in Estonia from Finland, so much so that the planes had to turn around. And these are not military aircraft. These are just like planes of people, tourists, citizens going into Estonia that couldn't land in Estonia because the Russian military was screwing with their GPS systems, which is really frightening.
Yeah, especially when you send me that article
Right.
hours before we got on a plane
And
to
we're going
fly
through
to
Finland.
Estonia.
Yeah, we're going through Finland.
You're
which
like,
is good.
oh, this is there's a chance that Russia is jamming airplane signals landing into Estonia. Cool. Anyway, I'll see you at the airport.
Right. And I truly was like, it won't be a big deal. And I was like, I should look at ferries from Finland to Estonia in case we don't get out of Finland.
And at that point, I'm like, is Finland by Estonia?
Oh, I was aware. I was like, oh, I totally know the geography. I'm fine. I'm
you
clear.
knew it for days.
Yeah, for days. Like, I knew it really well after I was on that big GPS map for about 40 minutes on the plane. I knew it.
You always do your research. That's what's so impressive. You definitely get on that plane and you zoom in. You use those two fingers to zoom in and be like, oh, that's where all the country, that's where Helsinki is. Now I know.
Poland, over there. Cool. We could go there. Another thing I will say, even just walking around Tallinn, the capital of Estonia, you see signs of like their reaction to Russia everywhere. In this beautiful old town or old city section is the Russian embassy. And what was that like?
It's remarkable. It's blocked off, and it's a whole city block full of just protest symbols, images of Navalny, even little shrines to Navalny, who passed away recently, Ukrainian flags, anti-Putin sentiments, graffiti, things of that nature. I remember walking through the town square, and at one of the restaurants in the town square had both in Estonian and English essentially asking when Putin was going to kill himself like Hitler did in
a
the
bunker. Right.
So,
It's like, where are we going to go to dinner? Oh, okay, that's not a menu.
what do they serve here? Putin's suicide?
Yeah.
Okay. What's the exchange rate for something like that? But it's palpable there. It's all part of the conversation. People were very blunt and open about it. Also, side note, Estonia is a beautiful country, and Tallinn was such a lovely, lovely town. I had no expectations of what it was like in Estonia, and this old town area with these cobblestone streets. It's a medieval city. It also has a bar that's the Depeche Mode bar, that is just Depeche Mode music that you go into a basement and they play Depeche Mode on videos and they have paraphernalia.
And Depeche Mode has enough of a catalog for it to be a bar exclusively dedicated to that, right?
I think
That's
so,
what
yes.
That's the good thing.
That's the good thing. And also, I don't believe there's any Estonian connection to Depeche Mode, but there is a Depeche Mode bar in Estonia that, guys, put it on your bucket list. Get there.
Depeche Mode bar feels like something like kind of Soviet era. Like we have a Depeche Mode bar.
Whatever that Venn diagram of Soviet era and Portlandia sketch is, I think it's Depeche Mode bar in Estonia.
But I will say one thing back to kind of this anti-Russian sentiment and this support for Ukraine on the Prime Minister's residence in Estonia. Every night they kind of project the Ukrainian flag, which I couldn't imagine them doing something like that here in America. Can you imagine if the White House had another flag projected on it?
Well, I believe, didn't we wave flags we passed funding for Ukraine military? There was some waving of Ukrainian flags, and that was not widely accepted as a lovely thing to do, if I recall. So, yes, it's very clear. Like when we got to meet the Prime Minister, which was really an honor for us to meet a head of state like that, she welcomed us in, and to be very clear, they are supportive of Ukraine and their battle here. They see it as not only important morally, but also for their own safety. They give more money percentage-wise to NATO and to military than the U.S. does. And so she was very forthcoming about that and that importance, the history of Estonia and the Estonian people, and specifically the history under Soviet occupation, and how, again, this is a history that they are grappling with and understand and have memories of. And this is part of the reason they're pushing back against that, because they really feel colonialism don't stop.
Right.
And it
Right.
it could continue, and it could continue soon if there isn't a real unified force to stop it.
Right. And I thought it was especially interesting. She described her own experience as a child.
Everybody is for peace, but we understand what peace under Soviet or Russian occupation means. You had mass atrocities, mass deportations. My own mother was deported to Siberia as a 6-month-old baby. There were mass killings. They were suppressing our culture, trying to erase our language. This is what peace under occupation means. That doesn't mean that the human suffering will stop.
Like, how wild was that to hear?
I mean, we had a taste of it in Hungary. This is the naive, somebody who didn't get to travel much abroad as a kid. Like when you go to Eastern Europe, you realize just how recent history is. In America, even though in England they'll make fun of Americans because our oldest things are only a couple hundred years old, but it feels like our moments of turmoil seem distant and in the past and revolution. And I remember in Budapest seeing bullet holes from protests 20 years earlier, and then stories 50 years earlier of this is where revolution takes place. And I think in Estonia, to hear these stories of like, oh, you have grandparents who were in the Gulag. You have you remember being under Russian occupation, running into other people around who had stories too. It's like, oh, this is not a hypothetical. And to bring it back to sort of the U.S. perspective on it, like we talk to people in the fields who are upset about things. It's all theory.
Right.
So much theory, so angry about things that we're crafting boogeymen out of middle schooler trans athletes
Right.
and people drinking Bud Light. Like we craft these folks and why they're keeping us down and these bad guys, bad enemies. And then you go to a place like Estonia and they're like, oh, do you know what it's like to live underneath an authoritarian regime? I do. I could tell you that story. It's not a theory. It's a reality, and I can articulate it. That's why we believe the things we believe.
Right. Like, we're flipping out over the cost of eggs being marginally higher, but she described her own daughter made some comment about, if this store doesn't have the thing I want, we'll go to the other store. And the prime minister, it made her think about her own childhood. She was like, there was no other store. That's not a thing that existed. This is the store. If they don't have it, you can't get it.
Yeah.
Like, for your life.
Then this is why we go there. I think we are lucky that we get to make these specials, but I think it was important to us. It's not just us talking about like, wow, look how misinformed we are. I think American gullibility is a real problem in this country. And it's a threat that has global repercussions. But I think a misunderstanding of the realities of what some people are pining for here is also a real threat. And so wherever we can go there and talk to people who have firsthand knowledge, like I think that's a real win for the things that we do here.